Hello and welcome to S7, Suturing in 7. My name is David Naysmith. If you found this video, then you're someone who wants to learn how to sew, or you may know how to sew, but you want to do it better or more efficiently. If so, I guarantee you that at the end of 7 days, if you stay with the program, that you will meet or exceed your goals. You may not know the difference between a 3/0 nylon or 4/0 chromic now, or a vertical mattress, or a running subcuticular stitch, but at the end of 7 days, you will be confident and competent to sew in most circumstances and close most wounds comfortably. Most suturing programs are based on sewing a pig's foot, and so you need to get access to a pig's foot. You need to have instruments, sutures, and then you need to have somebody to stand over you and teach you how to sew. This is easy on a one-off. However, you're not going to get many people who are going to be willing to sit with you week after week and teach you. What I hope to show you is that there is a kit that we're going to provide that will show you how to do suturing, and it will allow you to practice on a regular basis so that you can practice daily, weekly, as often as you wish, so that by the time you're in third year, you are competent. Now, there are many manuals out there to help you in this process. This is one of them. It's put out by Johnson & Johnson. Ethicon is their suturing branch, and it's on knot tying. It's a terrific little manual, and they very generously have given it to dental students, medical students, over the last 20 or 30 years, and they very kindly allowed me to use some of their images. The problem is that knot tying does not equate to wound closure. We need to teach principles of wound closure. We need to show you how to get the wound together, how to use your hands, how to be dexterous, and that's what we're going to do with this little kit that we're going to show you next. The question really is, why should we change what we've been doing for many, many years? Well, the simple truth is that what we've done just doesn't work that well. The problem is that students get to third year and they don't know how to sew. The goal of teaching should be that by the time you get to third year, that you feel competent and confident in closing wounds. My experience with this is that after teaching students in first and second year, only about 1 in 30 actually has the skill by the time they get to third year. So conventional teaching in suturing is almost always based on what is euphemistically known as the pig's foot lab. And what you do is get fresh pig's feet, and they must be fresh, and someone sits down with you and teaches you to sew. It's usually in first and second year. At the end of the day, you end up with a pig's foot with a bunch of lacerations on it that you've sewn up, and you feel pretty proud of it. You've sacrificed a bit of your time, but ultimately the real sacrifice is the pig. Now, one of the problems is that this thing in your backpack is not good for much more than about a day if you're going to have any friends left. And so to practice, you need to practice repetitively. You could go to the butcher shop and get a fresh pig's foot on a regular basis, but even with 2, 3, or 4 sessions, it's not enough. So again, the sad truth is that conventional teaching just doesn't work. As one of my colleagues said, if you showed up on a medical ward and didn't know how to use your stethoscope, they'd send you home. He went on to say that why should it be any different in surgery? You should be able to use basic instruments for wound closure. You should be dexterous with your fingers and know how to handle these instruments. And finally, the operating room is just not the place to learn. It's very expensive, and there's few surgeons who will take the time to actually teach in the operating theater. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is, it's just like your mom told you. Practice does make perfect. Now, if you're still upset with your mother over your adolescence, don't listen to your mother, but do listen to Malcolm Gladwell. He's a famous Canadian author, and he wrote a book called Outliers. He talks about the 10,000-hour rule. He talks about people who are really good at what they do. And what he found out was that to achieve mastery, you need to be about 10,000 hours into it to be world class. Now, we're not asking you to be world class by the time you come to third year. We just want you to be relatively competent. Each day is going to be much the same. The skills learned one day will apply to what you do the next day. So try to not necessarily master, but at least be competent and familiar with what we do each day, because these skill sets build one upon the other. Day 1, we'll have a look at the types of knots we use, and we'll focus on two-hand tying as a technical exercise. On day 2, we'll review that skill. We'll then go on and we'll learn the technical exercise of one-hand tying. We'll look at needles, suture materials, packaging, instruments, and those things are really going to be pivotal for day 3 when we start to do instrument ties. When we do day 3, we'll talk about how to hold the instruments first of all, and then we'll learn an instrument tie. Each day you'll see there are some tips that we're going to give you. These are critical, and they're fun things that will make you just a little bit better at what you do. On day 4, we'll start tying with sutures. We'll actually use a simple interrupted suture on the suture board that we have. Day 5 will be some special stitches. Now, the rule is that you should use the simplest suture possible to close any given wound. However, there are cases when you want to use things such as vertical mattresses, horizontal mattresses, or three-point sutures. On day 6, we're going to talk about deep wounds, wounds which require deep stitches. We'll talk about how to bury the knot, and then we'll talk about running sutures, and we'll focus on the subcuticular. And again, as always, there'll be some tips. And finally, on day 7, if you're going to put sutures in, you better know how to take them out. We'll also show you some things that are critical to use, such as drain sutures, catheter sutures, and then we're going to show you how to get out of trouble. All in all, a lot to learn in 7 days, but there's plenty of time, and I think you'll find that by the end of 7 days, you will be competent. Okay, let's have a look at the kit. This is the S7 kit, which is designed for suture practicing. It's small, and so it's fairly compact. You can go in a purse or a backpack or a briefcase. It's all inclusive. Everything that you need is in here. The instruments, the sutures, the rope for tying, and even a piece of artificial skin. It's clean, has no pig's fat on it, and you can use it pretty well anywhere. When you open it up, you'll see that the straps that hold it together are actually designed to hold it to your thigh. You can wrap them around your thigh. It fixes by Velcro, and it's stable on the thigh. And so you might say, why do we bother putting it on the thigh? Well, this emergency room physician has kindly demonstrated how not to sew. That is, he is too close to the wound. Learners want to get right down into it and put their nose right in the wound. You want to be about 18 inches away. Putting it on the thigh, you really have to try hard to get down that close to the wound. And so you're in a perfect position to learn how to sew in correct position. Once you open the kit, you'll see a number of features. The first is that there's a pouch to hold sutures. There's a second pouch which holds the template, and we'll talk about that later, the little rope for hand ties, and then there's a little first aid pouch. The first aid pouch comes out, and we'll talk about that later. Underneath that is the artificial skin surface. This is a terrific little invention. It's trilaminar. The beige layer simulates epidermis. The red layer simulates the dermis. And then the foam underneath is like fat. And they hold stitches about the same way. Fat doesn't hold a stitch, neither will the foam. So you have to be in the right layer. When the kit opens, there's a flap on the left side that flips up, exposing the instruments. And then there's a pouch up above that holds cards. I'll discuss those a little bit further. On the other side, the pouch holds a template and some rope. We'll talk about each of these as well. At the top, there's a sharps container. The information cards are two-sided, they're laminated, and they contain tips on how to sew, information on sutures, and a number of things that are going to be helpful as you learn to sew. The instruments are the standard needle driver. This is a wood crowel needle driver. It's a locking needle driver. The scissors are iris scissors. And the forceps, which are also known as pickups, is a single tooth forceps. It's called an Adson forceps. There are all kinds of different ones. The knife is a scalpel blade, and you can put disposable blades on that. Now you remember that I talked about the first aid kit. Here's the pouch, and I filled it with a number of items just to give you some idea of what it will hold. It essentially turns this thing into an advanced first aid kit. You won't need that suturing pad to suture on, so you might as well have something in there that's going to be useful. In this case, I have sterilized instruments so I can sew on people, and a number of other things. These don't come with the kit, but it's a nice addition. Now, also included is the template. This artificial skin surface is not skin, so it doesn't stretch quite the same way. So what I've done is I've put in the appropriate ratios for cutting out skin so you can get it together easily. As well, there's a little rope there for hand tying. We'll spend a lot of time on that. So here's the kit folded up. Is it essential to have it for this? Absolutely not. But will it make your life easier? You bet. And here it is in its entirety. Okay, so we're going to talk about knots today. This is obviously something which is critical to suturing. I stress that knot tying is not suturing, and that has been confused before, but without question, good knot tying is critical to good suturing. So there's a couple of questions that you want to ask at this point. One would be, what kinds of knots are there? And the second is, how many knots do I put for each specific stitch? When we look at the types of knots, we start with a very simple knot, and we need to get some terminology straight here. This first turn, or the first pass on the knot, we are going to call one knot. It has no wound closing strength at all. However, this is the first throw that we put down and sets the basis for all of the knots we're going to tie. The knot we really want to tie, and the one that has holding strength, is the square knot. For those sailors in the crowd, this is just a reef knot. The thing that I would stress about this is that it is two knots. If you look at it carefully, it's symmetric. And also note that it lies flat. This is something you're going to look for every time you tie a knot. This one looks a little bulkier, and when you look at it carefully, it's essentially two throws on the first pass. It's called a surgeon's knot, and we use it because it has increased friction. So if the wound isn't coming together and staying well, you want to place one of these. As you begin tying knots, try and compare them to these photographs. So now a question that if you ask 3 surgeons for an opinion, you'll get 4 opinions. Essentially, it depends on the nature of the stitch, whether it's braided or monofilament. The bulk of the stitch material versus the strength of the knot is critical. For braided stitches, they hold stitch better. And so I would recommend 3 knots minimum using a braided stitch. The nylon knots are a bit slipperier, and so they tend to slide a little bit, and I would say at least 4 knots. So that would be 2 square knots. When we look at the knots that we're going to use, again, compare to these photographs and work on technique when you're doing it. One well-tied knot is ever so much better than a bunch of poorly tied ones. Go slow. Make sure that you're laying them down flat and square. How tight do you want them? You just want these skin edges to kiss together, and that's all. And then again, that balance between how much suture material am I going to leave in the wound with the knot mass versus the holding strength. You might say, why do I bother learning to tie with my hands? I just want to use the instrument and do what everybody does in the emergency room, sewing up small wounds. Well, you need to be able to tie with your hands if you're going to be a surgical assistant. Two-handed ties, like all hand ties, give you control. What do I mean by control? Essentially, it allows you to control both ends of the suture at all times. This is critical if you're going to be sewing in deep holes. It also allows you to control tension on the wound closure. This may mean nothing to you now, but it will later. When you close a wide wound, you want tension. And if you want to assist at surgery, you better learn hand ties. Here's a little secret. If you know how to tie your own shoelaces, then you really already know how to do this. I mention that because during one teaching session we had, one of my colleagues, who was a very experienced sewer, came in to help teach. He could not teach hand ties. Although he can do them very well, he couldn't break them down, and it was baffling to him. I'm going to demystify this for you. Let's prepare by taking the kit, remove the skin surface, and then place the string through the grommets. Let's always put the blue string through the lower grommet so that when we look at the photographs, we can follow what we're doing. We're going to focus on the square knot. Have a look at it. It's flat. It's symmetric. We've talked about it before, and this is going to be our focus with suture tying. You can do a surgeon's knot, but for the sake of simplicity, let's just focus on the square knot. Now, hand tying, whether it's one hand or two hand tying, has an interesting little use of the hands. I want to talk about the concept of the jam cleat, and I want to talk about the concept of using your digits as a jam cleat. If you're a sailor, you know what I'm talking about. Here's a boom off a little dinghy. This is actually a cam cleat, but it's the same thing. Take the rope, put it in, and you've got it tight. Comes out easily. Put it in again, you've got it tight. This is the jam cleat. Can we do the same thing with our fingers? You bet. Thumb and index pulp together. Take the string, jam it in there. We can control that end. This is critical to knot tying. Let's have a look at a clinical example of a two-hand tie. This is a vein that's being ligated. And what I want you to notice with the two-hand tie is that both ends of the suture are being controlled at every step. The hands are being used in unison, going back and forth, but both ends of the stitch is controlled at all times. So two-handed ties, we're going to demystify this thing. We're going to break it down piece by piece. Start by taking the white stitch in the upper hole in the left hand. Notice it crosses the pulp of the index finger. Take the lower hand, pull it up, make an X on the pulp of the index finger. Next, all I want you to do is pinch the thumb and the index finger together. That's all. What have we done? We've made the little jam cleat. The next thing we're going to do is to rotate the wrist, and this is critical. The wrist must rotate, and you're going to rotate it, and in so doing, the little jam cleat passes through the loop in the stitch and then allows us to take the stitch end in the right hand, push it into the jam cleat of the thumb and index finger. Follow along with this. Do that again if you need to. The next move is that we let go with the right hand. Notice that we actually have control of both ends of the stitch. You'll remember I said this was critical with hand ties of all kinds. We now have control of both ends in the left hand. The next move will simply be to rotate the wrist once again back to its original position. In so doing, we swing the blue end of the suture back through the suture loop and deliver it to the right hand. Rotate the wrist now and pick up the free end of the suture with the right hand. Note that we're hanging on to the white end with our small ring and long fingers. Now we're going to separate the hands. The right hand is going to go north, the left hand is going to go south. This is critical. It's critical because it allows the knot to lay down flat. Separate the hands. We've got the first portion of the square knot done. Now, just as an aside, should you wish to do a surgeon's knot, all you really need to do is just repeat that first portion once again. The next move will be that we swing the thumb under the stitch on the left hand, then we're going to take the right hand, pull it down across the thumb, and once again what you will see is that we make an X on the pulp of the thumb. There it is. The next move will be simply bring the thumb and index finger together again on the left hand, creating that jam cleat. There it is. And from here, what we're going to do is rotate the wrist, take the jam cleat through the suture, and jam the blue end into it. Once again, what you'll see is we let go with the right hand, that we've controlled both ends of the stitch. Here it is. The left hand has control of both ends. The right hand is free. From here, we're simply going to rotate the wrist once again. It's all about wrist rotation, remember. And we've controlled both ends in doing this, and push it through the gap in the sutures. The right hand, which is now free, will pick up the free end of that stitch. As it does, the hands, once again, are going to separate. This time, the left hand going north, the right hand going south. As we do this, we tighten the knot down, and what we see is we get our square knot. Remember this rhythm of the hands, alternating back and forth. One side, the other side. One side, the other side. We end up with a square knot at the end of it. It's really pretty simple. Now you've tied one knot. You want to tie another? Look where your left hand is. Simply swing the index finger under. You're back to where you started. So two-handed ties, actually very simple. Things to remember is that you're controlling both ends of the stitches at all times. You're using the pinched finger as a jam cleat. And the key is rotation of the wrist to move the suture end. And then what we call, or what I call at least, the rhythm of knot tying. The hands alternating back and forth. So the first thing I need to tell you is that suturing is a learned skill. Virtually everyone can learn to sew. There are no God-given sutures. It all comes down to the value of practice. And I'm not talking about simple practice, I'm talking about deliberate practice, where you set goals for the day. Today I'm going to learn a square knot, today I'm going to learn a simple interrupted, and at the end of the day, have that skill. So here's one of the most recognizable faces and names in sports history, Wayne Gretzky, also known as the Great One, known as the greatest hockey player ever. When he asked Wayne about how he did it, he said he wasn't naturally gifted in terms of size or speed, but that he worked for everything that he got. He was interviewed once by the Canadian journalist Peter Zosky, and Peter asked him about practice. He said, it's absolutely right, it's all practice. And he made an interesting reference to medicine. He said that you don't learn medicine by not practicing. He said he thought he practiced as much as any doctor practiced. My guess is more. Here's Cal Ripken Jr., the new Iron Man of baseball, an astounding number of feats. First of all, 19 All-Star games, 2 MVPs, over 2,600 consecutive games. He said, I was the one with the most energy, the one who practiced longer. And here's the fascinating thing, and this is the important part. He said, other guys like to practice what they do best. I practice what I do poorly. This speaks to deliberate practice. Here's Yo-Yo Ma, well known to anyone in music world. Over 100 CDs, 18 Grammys, wonderful collection. I actually enjoy practice more and more. It unites what you want to do. And Gary Player, one of my all-time favorites. Gary is a fabulous golfer, and he was respected by everyone on the circuit. He was in the World Golf Hall of Fame. And he said something which has been attributed to many people. He said, the more I work and practice, the luckier I seem to get. Interestingly, a number of people laid claim to having said that, and it's with the same with all absolute truths. Everyone wants to take credit for it. Finally, I'm going to talk about an article by James Clear. He put together 3 people that normally you wouldn't associate, Mozart, Picasso, and Kobe Bryant. He tried to figure out what it was that they all did that made them so good. What do the people who master their goals do different than the rest of us? They practice. And so it's a pretty clear message. Practice is so important. Now, one of the things I have to draw to your attention is that for Wayne, his dad built him a rink in his backyard, and he was holding a hockey stick by the time he was 2 years of age. So for Wayne, it was easy to head out into the backyard, and practice was easy for him. The question you want to ask now is, how can I make practice easy for me when it comes to sewing? Well, the answer is take your S7 kit with you. Whenever you get 20 minutes, sit down and do it. So each day, at the end of the day, we're going to talk about the takeaways. In other words, what are the things I really want you to remember? Well, first of all, everyone can sew. I think I've stressed the value of deliberate practice. You need to know about the types of knots. We've had a look at those. And then we've an introduction to the S7 suture kit. You started to tie, and you've tied with a two-handed tie. This is a critical skill if you're going to assist. It also is good to do with instrument ties. And so learn this well. Next day, we'll learn a one-handed tie. So, as we look at tomorrow, what we're going to do is review the two-handed tie, learn the one-handed tie, and then we need to start talking about the things you need to know about in order to do instrument ties. Needles, suture materials, how they package them, what instruments we use, and then there'll be some tips on how to start sewing.